I'm thinking about Martin Buber's moral philosophy for a conference by women, I take as inspiration references to Buber by two anti-racist philosophers that grappled with the socially and politically burdened body. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement in the United States, and Frantz Fanon, the Francophone father of post-colonialism. I will trace two genealogical paths, one leading through King and the other through Fanon, each giving a different account of knowledge and embodiment in Buber's moral philosophy, and each with different implications for reading Buber as a woman. So often the only exposure to Buber's ideas in the United States is a text studied by nearly all of our pupils, Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from Birmingham jail. King analyzes the harm of racial segregation using Buber's account of I-it relations, and reads Buber as following in the Kantian tradition of critiquing the use of persons as mere things. So King writes, segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. So in this account, the genealogy goes from Kantian moral philosophy to Buber's I-thou, I-it distinction to King's notion of just and unjust laws. And we can speculate what kind of feminist moral philosophy would follow this path as a kind of sibling to King's anti-racist work. Perhaps notions like reciprocal recognition or equal rights capture the view that I-thou relations entail respect for personhood, as well as the view that a relational ontology entails taking as a strict duty working for justice and not simply respecting autonomy. There's a lot more that could be said about this use of Buber, but for the sake of time, I will simply point out that it is a problem that it bases moral response on the use of reason and principles. For reason and principles do not appear in Buber's account of moral knowledge. Instead, he gives us dramatic accounts of bodily knowledge. So here are three examples. I apologize, I'm going to read some lengthy quotes from Buber, but I think it's important. So first, mutual sexual relations as depicted in his 1929 dialogue. He writes, that inclination of the head over there, you feel how the soul enjoins it on the neck. You feel it not on your neck, but on that one over there, on the beloved one. And yet you yourself are not, as it were, snatched away. You are here in the feeling of self-being, and you receive the inclination of the head, its injunction, as the answer to the word of your own silence. The two who are loyal to the eros of dialogue, who love another, receive the common event from the other's side as well. That is, they receive it from two sides, and thus, for the first time, understand in a bodily way what an event is. Second, infliction of violence, as depicted in his 1925 Education. A man belabors another who remains quite still. Then let us assume that the striker suddenly receives in his soul the blow which he strikes, the same blow, that he receives it as the other who remains still. For the space of the moment, he experiences the situation from the other side. Reality imposes itself on him. This is from his 1951 Distance and Relation. I experience, let us say, the specific pain of another in such a way that I feel what is specific in it. Not therefore a general discomfort or state of suffering, but this particular pain is the pain of the other. This making present increases until it is a paradox in the soul when I and the other are embraced by a common living situation. And the pain which I inflict upon him surges up in myself, revealing the abyss of the contradictoriness of life between man and man. One last example, the suffering of an absent other, as depicted in Buber's 1957 interview by psychologist Carl Rogers. In discussing the impact of World War I and the death of Gustav Landauer, Buber says, I could not resist what was going on, and I was compelled, to may I say so, to live it. Things went on just in this moment. You may call it imagining the real, imagining what was going on. For 4 years, this influenced me terribly. just when it was finished by a certain episode in May 19, when a friend of mine, a great man, was killed by anti-revolutionary soldiers in a very barbaric way. And now I again once more was compelled to imagine his killing, but not in an optical way alone, but may I say so with my body.
Is this still okay?
This is okay. So a few things jump out in these passages. First, Buber is insisting that access to shared reality comes through the body. So often intensive bodily experiences are taken to be private, but here it is by going into the body that the person enters a common living situation and a common event. Emphasizing that this is not projection or voluntary fantasy, Buber says that we receive this reality and describes this entrance into a common world of embodied beings in often unpleasant ways, so explaining why we might seek to escape this bodily knowing of reality, writing of being compelled and terribly influenced as reality imposes itself. Second, we understand in a bodily way what is specific and particular without ever identifying or merging with another. So as he puts it in the first example, you yourself are not, as it were, snatched away. So for Buber, this knowledge is derived from neither reason nor empathy. Reason plays a limited role in Buber's understanding of the types of knowing possible for us. He explains, reason cannot replace the smallest perception of something particular and unique with its gigantic structure of general concepts, cannot by means of it contend in the grasping of what here and now confronts me. And when talking about syllogistic moral analysis using principles and rules, such as we just saw King doing, he critiques this as the absurdity of consulting a dictionary to figure out how to respond to another. So although some may want to call this bodily knowing of a particular lived experience empathy, Buber insists that this is not a feeling, but a living with. He prefers to use the words imagining the real and inclusion to describe experiencing two sides simultaneously. Reason substitutes the universal for the particular, and empathy, he feared, substitutes one particular for another. Instead, he is after a type of knowing between particulars in which they enter into a shared reality without ever losing their own point of view, a so to speak coincidence of opposites. Finally, the examples are devoid of common moral concepts, such as reciprocity, equality, and respect. Within a strict Kantian genealogy, sexual and violent encounters are paradigmatic examples of treating another as a means to an end. And yet Buber offers them up as paradigmatic examples of dialogic relations. For Buber, reciprocity, equality, and respect are important features of some moral relationships, but they are not foundational. Rather, mutuality is what is primary, with the former being special cases of mutuality. This is important because otherwise we may think, following the Kantian genealogy, that Buber is only concerned with relations between human persons of equal capacity, when in fact he is also interested in asymmetrical relations that cannot expect reciprocity or equality precisely for moral reasons, such as teacher-student or therapist-patient, as well as we've seen, human-plant, human-animal, and human-divine relations. So a lot more to explore with respect to embodiment in Buber's epistemology and moral philosophy. For the sake of time, I want to come back to how we can relate Buber's embodied knowing to embodiment as a woman. In particular, I want to ask how a socially and politically overdetermined body, an alienated body, is supposed to know and participate in this dialogic reality. And so to address this question, I'm going to turn to a different genealogy. In a little studied reference to Buber, Frantz Fanon writes at the end of his first book, the 1952 Black Skin, White Mass, superiority, inferiority, why not the quite simple attempt to touch the other, to feel the other, to explain the other to myself? Was my freedom not given to me then in order to build the world of the you? And so in the original French, this is toi, capitalized and italicized. It's the only time he does this in the book, so it's very obvious it's a technical term. So was my freedom not given to me then in order to build the world of the you? At the conclusion of this study, I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. My final prayer, oh my body, make of me always a man who questions. So on the one hand, we have a genealogy going from Kantian moral philosophy to Buber to King. And on the other hand, we have Fanon as a descendant of Buber, which points to a different forefather, I think, and I think this is Nietzsche. And it's this second genealogy that I think is more helpful when thinking about the relevance of Buber for those with burdened bodies. Fanon's invocation to his body in reference to Buber comes at the end of a long meditation on his racialized existence. At first, his body gives him neutral knowledge of presence in the world. He writes, consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness. I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to reach out my right arm and take the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. The matches, however, are in the drawer to my left, and I shall have to lean back slightly. And all of these movements are made not out of habit, but out of implicit knowledge, a slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world. But the problem is that space and time are politically saturated. So think about how Fanon's example of moving his arm to take a pack of cigarettes changes were he to be sitting in a car pulled over by the police. Through everyday racialized interactions, his third-person consciousness turns into alienation as he realizes that he is never fully seen as himself, but always as mere body, and that this body is not even seen as its dynamic self, but only as a marker of a group. He writes, it was no longer a question of being aware of my body in the third person, but in a triple person. So he's going to move from a neutral third-person perspective to a fragmentation of the self into three. Okay, so he continues, I existed triply, I occupied space, I moved toward the other, and the evanescent other, hostile but not opaque, transparent, not there, disappeared, nausea. And this is the triple person. I was responsible at the same time for my body, for my race, for my ancestors. Completely dislocated, unable to be abroad with the other, the white man who unmercifully imprisoned me, I took myself far off from my own presence, far indeed, and made myself an object. What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, a hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood? But I did not want this revision, this thematization. All I wanted was to be a man among other men. I wanted to come lithe and young into a world that was ours and to help build it together. So it's a very poignant account of wanting to enter into dialogue and moving toward the other, only to have the other withdraw and make themselves invisible, reflecting back to him his own distorted body, fragmenting his identity. The moral harm of monologic or I-it relations is often understood to involve the projection of ideas onto another. For example, Buber talks about how over time memory creates fixed ideas which become the content of I-it relations. And this is one aspect of Fanon's description of the body as existing in politicized space and time. But focusing on dialogue and monologue as purely mental relations and not as also or primarily bodily relations misses the mark. It ignores Buber's deeply embodied descriptions of dialogic relations, and it does not capture the reality of socially and politically burdened bodies. As Fanon writes, I am not the slave of the idea that others have of me, but of my own appearance. He moves his body forward and they move their body back, rendering him partnerless. In Buber's language, this is the self as it, positioned, trapped, and burdened within space and time, not properly a mental projection, but a distortion within bodily encounter itself. When thinking about how to combat this, Fanon writes that he initially oscillated between identifying as pure reason and pure emotion. So rejecting stereotypes by proving his rationality, or embracing stereotypes by showing the value of emotion, and neither worked. He wrote, "My unreason was countered with reason, my reason with real reason." At the end of the book, where he refers to Buber's notion of I-thou relations, he makes a different move. Rebuffed from dialogue with another body, he instead dialogues with his own body, speaks directly to his body, now no longer third person but second person. His body is what is prayed to, his body is the source of freedom, his body is the source of questioning, the gateway, the open door of every consciousness, his body that will build the world of the you. So whereas King pulled out a Kantian strand of Buber, Fanon, I think, is drawing on a Nietzschean strand. We know that Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra was of great importance for the young Buber, and Professor Mendes Floor has written of the influence of Nietzsche on Buber's early Zionist activities and called for a spiritual and cultural Jewish renaissance. Beyond Buber's early appropriation of Nietzsche's cultural criticism and emphasis on creative power, I believe Buber was also inspired by Nietzsche's notion of the body as a source of intelligence, an inspiration that lasted the entirety of his life. Nietzsche diagnoses contempt of the body as a cultural sickness, more precisely, a sickness within the body itself, for he takes the denial of the body to be itself an activity of body. After calling on us to listen to the voice of the healthy body, he writes, "The body is a great reason, a plurality with one sense. An instrument of your body is also your little reason, my brother, which you call spirit. A little instrument and toy of your great reason. I, you say, and are proud of the word. But greater is that in which you do not wish to have faith, your body and its great reason, that does not say I, but does I." And now following Buber and Fanon, we may add to Nietzsche's lines, "Your body and its great reason, that does not say thou, but does thou." So although racialized and gendered existence are not reducible to one another, examining how anti-racist philosophers appropriated Buber's philosophy can illuminate the ways he may prove fruitful for a woman-centered approach. From the well-known example of King, we are given a genealogy in which Buber is a Kantian. While that is an important strand of his thought, it misses the way that Buber was articulating a way of knowing in and through the body. While framing gendered oppression as a matter of laws and principles is clearly of great legislative significance, it does not capture the phenomenological experience of oppression. Without grappling with this, legislative change may remain a mere facade. The deeper work of changing bodily relations still remaining. So turning to the example of Fanon, we find a vivid account of bodily relations under a state of oppression, creating a different genealogy running through Buber and back to Nietzsche. This genealogy challenges us to ask, what would it be like to no longer try to escape, dominate, or punish the body? To cultivate and embrace the healthy, beautiful, and creative body, to listen to and trust the body, to see the body as the source of moral response. My final wish for all of us here, let our bodies make of us always women who question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk.